Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great joy to be back at Cure, to be with you today. I just wanted to speak a little bit about the upcoming ordination, and especially this year in October 10th, right, is the 100th anniversary of this parish of Cure of ours, which most especially is in honor of St. John Vianney, whose statue overlooks our church from up top, who is the patron saint of parish priests. And we've seen in the back on the posters and banners in different areas around the church that God has called many men from this church in its 100 years to serve as priests, including our own Father Joe Schlafer. There are currently 8 men in the seminary for the diocese, and it's not necessarily that God is not calling, because of course he is. He is always calling all of us to a life of intimacy and relationship, but in a special way he calls young men to serve as his priests and to stand in his place at the altar, in baptism, at the bedside of the dying, and of course in the confessional as well. So as Father Frank said, I just spent the last 7 years in the seminary, now gearing up for this culmination next weekend of ordination to the priesthood. But sometimes we can be a little bit afraid of, vocations, whatever God calls us to, but especially the priesthood. I think there can be a little bit of hesitation where people could say, oh yeah, I'll pray for vocations, I'll pray that we get more priests, but not my son, not my grandson. I want grandkids, all this stuff. And I think that those are all, of course, very human feelings. But the reality is, if there's somebody that God is calling to be a priest, you will not be losing a handful of grandchildren, but gaining hundreds, if not thousands, of spiritual grandchildren. The reality is that the priesthood is a heroic life of glory and intimacy with Jesus Christ. And Father Frank just last month celebrated his 45th anniversary. So you can think about, in those 4.5 decades, all the people that he has encountered and served, nourished in the Eucharist, forgiven in confession, and reconciled with God in their final moments of life. And so any of the young men here, I beg you just to be open, whatever it is, to however God is calling you to live a life of intimacy with him. Of course, something I learned in my days studying at Franciscan University was the prayer, Jesus, help me to want for me what you want for me. So I encourage all of us here to be able to pray that prayer, after Mass or before bed this evening, but also to all of us who know young men, to ask them that question. But also sometimes it can be a great source of sadness and sorrow for us when there are people we know and people we love who do not come to Mass, whether they do not know the Lord or they have chosen for one reason or another to back away from the church. And of course, that's such a great source of sorrow for so many of us. So what I would encourage you to do is to not be discouraged. We never know how long one invitation will go. So never get tired of inviting somebody to come to Mass or to come to the church and light a candle, to be able to talk about the faith, to introduce them to Father Frank and Father Joe. The priesthood, John Vianney, our dear patron, says the priesthood is the love of the heart of Jesus. So when we think about the priesthood, we can think about how much Jesus loves us enough to give us a share in his own life, but especially to give us the sacrament so that we can journey towards our heavenly home. So I encourage you all to be open to what God has for you, but especially if you know any young men, to be open with them, to ask them. When I was on my pastoral year, this is the last thing I'll say, when I was on pastoral year at St. Patrick's in Huntington, where next Sunday at 11:30 I will say my first Mass as a priest, I met a boy in religious ed. I taught religious ed every week. And I said to this 7th grader, have you ever thought about being a priest? And he looked at me like he just watched a horrific car accident. He was so petrified. But I said to him, but the only reason I'm asking you is because I think you would be great. I think you'd be a great priest. So when we ask the question, we have to acknowledge that we see something in a young man that God could use to bring about his kingdom on earth and to be able to bring others close to him. So I'd encourage you all to pray for vocations today, and also to pray for family members and friends who you think would make a great priest, and for those who are far from the Lord and from the church, to say Hail Mary for them today and ask our Blessed Mother to take them by the hand and bring them back home. God bless you. Thank you.